recovered from the debate yet?
Kind of.
Big night. It was an interesting night, and I think that anybody that was paying close attention would notice real differences between all three of the candidates.
Yeah.
And maybe you'd want to talk about that, touch on what makes you different from the Republican and Democratic candidates.
Well, the Republican, of course, was pushing for what we've done for the last 34 years, which is tax cuts and deregulation. And I think that people ought to be able to learn from history. 34 years of tax cuts have not led to prosperity. They've led to the rich become insanely wealthy and the poor become more and more poor, including people literally living out on the streets nowadays, which you didn't see before Reagan came in. And deregulation, of course, has led to massive crime sprees, most recently the banking crime spree, which Obama, of course, has not prosecuted anyone from. Even though fraud is a crime, perjury is a crime. Remember the Robo signing when millions of people were thrown out of their homes because of perjury? Now what should have happened is those people should have stayed in their homes and those bankers should have been prosecuted for perjury, but that is not what happened. There was even a guy down in Florida got thrown out of his home because of this perjury, and he didn't even have a mortgage. They just threw him out. They made it up. They lied, which is perjury, which is illegal, and nothing happened to them. So I don't think that deregulation, and even Bill brought up the Massey energy coal mine explosion and the Deep Horizon oil explosion down in the Gulf of Mexico, which killed 11 workers and poisoned millions and millions of seabirds and other marine wildlife, destroying the livelihood of thousands of people in the Gulf of Mexico, and not one person was prosecuted for that either. This is what happens. It isn't just deregulation, it's also decriminalization and not prosecuting. This is what the Obama administration is doing. There are laws in the books, but they're not enforcing them. So I don't think deregulation is right at all. This is, like I said the other night, regulations are laws for corporations, and if you don't have laws for corporations, corporations will become criminal, and they have. And as far as the tax cuts, of course, we had the Reagan tax cuts, which instantly made a lot of people unemployed, and farmers lost their farms. You remember the 80s when hundreds of thousands of farmers actually lost their farms. Murder rates went up, suicide rates went up, alcoholism, child abuse. This is what happens when people lose their livelihood. And this is what happens when you cut taxes and you give it all to the people on top. The people on the bottom suffer. And then, of course, also in the 80s, millions of factory workers lost their jobs. So what did they do? They opened up prisons. We went from 2 prisons in Southern Illinois in 1980 to 14 today. And they took those farmers that lost their farms and they put them to work as prison guards, guarding the people that lost their factory jobs in Chicago. And that's their economic recovery. Endless prisons. I don't see it. Obviously, that's something I differ with both of them. Although Bill Enyart, of course, pays lip service to more fair taxation and regulations. He's a Democrat, and Obama is a Democrat. And Obama and the Democrats, first we had the Reagan tax cuts. That wasn't bad enough. We went for the Bush tax cuts. That threw us into an even deeper depression. And then the Democrats took charge in 2010. They had the White House, they had Congress, they had the House of Rep, they had the Senate. And what they do in December 2010, when they had complete control, they voted to permanently extend the Bush tax cuts, which were scheduled to expire in 2011. So really, even though Democrats talk different, when their actions are the same. So that's the difference, one of the big differences. And of course, I care about the environment. Both Bost, Freudian slip there. Both Bost and Enyart are for coal and fracking. They both pay lip service to the idea that, oh yes, someday we need to get off fossil fuels. Well, they've been saying that since the 70s when we hit peak oil back in 1972. Every president since then has said we need to get off fossil fuels. And here's Bost and Enyart going, yeah, but not yet. So I, of course, stand for a Green New Deal, which would bring full employment at living wages, transitioning from the fossil fuel dependent economy that we have right now to a renewable energy sustainable prosperity.
Could you go into a little bit more on the Green New Deal and how, sort of where the money comes from, where the money goes? I mean, Republicans, Democrats, big business, corporations, regulation, deregulation, and defense are all evil. So kind of explain, you used the term a lot last week, but in the debate format it's hard to really get into saying what beyond sort of the part of your platform that's the environment, talk about all else.
But let me just point out that I don't really use the terms good and evil. That's kind of a Bushian, kind of a cartoon vision of the world.
I've been called way worse.
But what I'm saying is the whole good versus evil thing, they use that to get us into war. They use it to get us into, well, they use it in a lot of ways that I consider not wise. So I don't really use good versus evil. Everyone can be capable of good, everyone's capable of evil. It depends on the situation that we are in. And so I want to change the situation so that law-abiding people have a chance to flourish and prosper, and not just people who are criminals, psychopaths, and have no care about other people. Those are the people that now rise to the top because we have a criminal producing society, criminogenic, I think is the word that they use. But the Green New Deal is a harking back to the New Deal. Like I said, we should be able to learn from history. We know that 34 years of tax cuts have not led to a generalized prosperity. Instead, they've led to wide inequality of wealth and rampant homelessness and hunger and poverty in the people. The New Deal, on the other hand, back in 1933, when Roosevelt came in, he put 4 million people, unemployed people, to work in 6 months. 4 million people. That's a lot of people. We can do that again. We can learn from history and go for the things that actually help people and not for the things that hurt people. So what we would do with this New Deal, back then, they did all kinds of things. They didn't just plant trees and make the Shawnee National Forest and build giant city lodge, and they planted something like 6 billion trees in the New Deal. Not just at Shawnee National Forest, but they made other national forests, and they tried to overcome the destruction of the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, which was caused by farmers plowing up the prairie, and then when the drought came, most of that topsoil blew away. So they planted hedgerows and trees. That's another thing they did. And then, of course, they put people to work building roads and bridges and national parks. You can see things all over this country, post office. But they built post offices, and then they hired artists to paint murals. And they hired musicians to give concerts. And they hired actors to put on plays. They helped the country not just physically, not just economically, but also culturally, because that's important to also have art and music, bread and roses too. You have to have all of that stuff, and we could do that again. We could have the Green New Deal, which would and another thing they did was, of course, bring electricity to rural areas, such as the TVA. We could bring electricity.
What is
the Tennessee Valley Authority.
Okay.
That's where they brought, because it wasn't profitable for electric companies to bring electricity to people like us, so the government stepped in and did it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have electricity. So we could do that again, only this time with renewable electricity. This time with sustainable transportation. This time planting trees to rebuild our forests. And for instance, here in Southern Illinois, the Audubon Society proposes an unbroken canopy of forest because we're on the Mississippi Flyway. And the migrating birds need a chance to stop and rest. We have the problem of runoff from our farmlands going into the Mississippi River and causing a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. We could restore wetlands along the Mississippi River as sort of a sop to that farm runoff, and also a flood control kind of thing, to where when it floods, it goes into the wetlands. Then when it doesn't flood, you have a wildlife habitat, you have a place for tourists, you have a place for hunters, fishermen, people that like to hike. You have an attraction, not just to birds, but to people.
You used a phrase often in your debate about money, like public money. What is that phrase?
Non-debt-based public money supply?
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the Constitution says that the Congress shall, be able to issue and control the value of money. But that's actually never been used since the Constitution was written. We've always had a private debt-based money supply in this country, meaning that there is no money in our country. We have no permanent money supply. The only money we have is when someone borrows it. So that way when interest rates are low and people go on a credit buying spree, then, then money is loose and everyone's prosperous and times are good. But when there's tight money, as they used to call it, that's when no one's borrowing. So there's a decreased amount of money circulating in the economy. You can't have a market economy without money circulating. That's just, you absolutely cannot have it. Otherwise, you go to you can't have actually an advanced society unless you have a market society, and you can't have a market society unless you have money supply. And the way our money supply is now is irrational, because in order for us to have a money supply, as I said, someone has to borrow it. So now we have $1 trillion in student debt, we have $1 trillion in credit card debt, we have the housing debt, which of course collapsed. We have I said credit card, student, and then cars, what else? And then, of course, the federal government debt and the state debt. All of this is the way that we get money into the economy because there is no permanent money supply, which is absolutely absurd. So I say that we nationalize the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank that they put in 1913 with the promise that the whole problem of the boom and bust cycles that they had up until then would be solved by the Federal Reserve, which would make money available at very low interest rates. And then they said, well, if you had a depression, you could make more money available, and then people would borrow, and then you'd get the economy moving again. But clearly that's not working, because right now the Fed has interest rates for the banks at like 0.025% or something absolutely.
So you nationalize the Federal Reserve.
So
how does that happen, and then what happens next?
Well, what you do is you take it out of the control of the 13 private banks that own it now, and you put it under the control of Congress, right? You have a national institute like the Pentagon or any other federal government thing. And then they would issue money. Either they could do it at low interest rates for things like, small businesses say they want to borrow money to go into business. Then they can borrow it at low interest rates from the Federal Reserve. And actually, I didn't realize this till recently, but the original Federal Reserve Act had a provision in it where people could borrow from it, not just banks. But that was taken out with the Dodd-Franklin so-called Reform Act. Dodd-Frank, not Franklin, sorry. They took that provision out. So that's what I mean by it. So, and the other way they could help the economy would be to issue money into the economy without debt by spending it into the economy by paying labor to do socially necessary things. For instance, they could issue, actually Lincoln did this to fight the Civil War. The greenbacks were debt-free money. He just issued it to fight the war. So I shouldn't say it's never been done since 1787. It was done that one time. But you issue money and say they issue $1 trillion, and they use it to spend people to pay people to plant trees, to set up renewable energy, to rebuild light rail, to build light rail trolleys, to pay for schools. For instance, our schools are falling apart and the teachers are being laid off. And no, you issue money to pay for schools. You issue money to pay for health. You issue money to pay for social services, for instance, nursing homes. There's this big scandal where Ronner Wright, the horrible ways they treat old people in nursing homes. You could take care of that by issuing money to make sure that people are taken care of right. So then when you get the money into the pockets of workers, then they spend it into their local economies. And this is how, and once the money is issued, then it circulates. You go spend it at the grocery store takes it and spends it at the hardware store, takes and spends, they pay their workers and they go out. And that's how you have a flourishing market economy. Right now, with the debt-based money supply, when you borrow money, you only borrow the principal, you don't borrow the interest. And the only way you can pay the interest back is if more money is issued. More money is borrowed, not issued, if more money is borrowed. So you constantly have to have an inflating money supply in order to pay back the interest on the previous loans. This is inflationary. If you are a saver, if you're the kind of person that just wants to put your money in the bank, then you get screwed, basically, because your money becomes worthless as more and more money is issued into the economy to pay back the interest from the loans. then the money becomes more and more worthless. So what a dollar could buy in 1970, a dollar could not buy today, because they had to issue so much more money into the economy to pay back the interest. And eventually all the money goes up on top. And this is why you see Main Street boarded up and Wall Street, has big skyscrapers and $1 million bonuses in December. This is where they get the money. They get the money from all of us struggling to pay back these loans. And like I said, the Federal Reserve is now issuing money at like 0.025%, something like that. But credit card loans are like 18, 20%. And these payday loans are sometimes 1,000%. I mean, if you look at it annually. So this is ridiculous. The money is just being siphoned off from the poor people and going to the top 1%. And it's not sustainable. The whole thing will crash. And then what? Then you have to have a backup plan, and my plan is putting people to work, making a better society. It already crashed in 2008, but here's the thing. The Federal Reserve has been giving $65 billion a month to prop Wall Street up. That's not sustainable either.
So the money that you want to see, I guess the question is, how do we get from here to there?
Well, actually, Dennis Kucinich had introduced a bill to do this very thing. It was called the American, okay, I might be mangling this, but the American Monetary Reform Act. And he introduced it. I would just reintroduce it.
Well, let's assume I don't know the salient points of it. Why don't you kind of walk us through that?
Well, that's what it is. It is an act to nationalize the Federal Reserve, to turn it over to those boring, gray-suited bureaucrats that know how to run things and have it regulated the way banks are supposed to be regulated. And then the Federal Reserve would do what they did in the New Deal. I was like, I'm kind of blown away how FDR could put 4 million people to work in 6 months. That obviously that was not one person. That was him going, handing out money that they borrowed to people all over the country that knew what they were doing. For instance, we have people here in Carbondale who are working on revitalizing Main Street, refurbishing our buildings. They want to have a transportation hub. They want to have, what else? Just all kinds of ideas. There are all kinds of ideas, but they don't have the money, so they can't do it. This is what we would do in a Green New Deal. We would say, here's $100 million. Do everything that you want to do. Then they would hire
come from
the Nationalized Federal Reserve. It would be issued debt-free, not borrowed, just spent into the local economy. That means that Carbondale, all of a sudden, would have, I don't know how much it would really be, $1 million here, $1 million there. Pretty soon you're talking real money, However much it would be to revitalize Carbondale, then that money would be here locally in Carbondale, and it would be spent locally, and the people would be more prosperous, and that money would just circulate, and people could do things that they wanted to do. They could go to the art show or whatever.
Where does the National Reserve get that money?
They create it out of thin air. They create it on a computer. That's the bizarre thing. If you borrow money, that money doesn't exist before. They create it, and that's why it's inflationary. They just create it on the computer, and they go, okay, that is now credited to your account. Like when you go to the bank and you borrow money from the bank, they just create that money, and they put it into your account. Now, your bank has what's called a fractional reserve requirement, which is getting ridiculously low, meaning that if they have $1,000 in deposits, they can loan out $100,000 with that fraction, that's why it's called fraction, in reserve, to back it up, right? But they've just created $100,000 on your $1,000, and then, and then they can create like $90,000 on that, because now they've got this credited, the money they just created so you can go buy your house and you write that check, then that now is their asset, as well as their liability. It's really weird how the accounting is, but it's not really anything that you would think would be right.
So if I follow you, you got this nationalized Federal Reserve, and the purpose is to fund good works, put people to work, get money in circulation. I understand that. And as in your example, Carbondale is able to get the money that it needs to revitalize the community. I'm still following you, okay?
Yeah.
There's
doing
thousands
way
of
better
other
than me
co-
because I don't understand any of it.
There's thousands of other Carbondales across the country.
Right.
How is there enough money for all of them?
They can create any amount of money they want. It's just like, do you realize that we are now something like trillions of dollars? If you count the credit derivative swaps, the world is like $750 trillion in debt. They've created all that money. It's not real. It's not real wealth. They've just created it. And it's not doing any good. It's not being put to any productive capacity. It's just out there, like this giant vampire squid that is sucking the life out of honest people's honest labor and the real world's real natural wealth. They can create. That's what they did in the New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
They gave money to all kinds of communities. There was little community. I mean, I was traveling through New Mexico.
Where does that money come from?
It's created. Just the same as it's created now, but now it's created as a debt. I'm saying create it just as a public necessity. You can't have, like I said, because I'm repeating myself, but you can't have a market economy without a money supply. All I'm saying is, and actually there was a big movement for a public money supply. I quote Thomas Edison sometimes. If a country can issue a bond on the full, what is it they call it, full weight and gravity or something. I forget the phrase. But if they can create a bond, a government bond, a treasury bond, on the goodwill or the wealth of its citizenry, well then they can create a dollar. Just that the bond enriches the bankers and the dollar enriches the community. I'll have to find that quote and send it to you. And that makes total sense to me. They are creating money.
Mm-hmm. It's your contention that the government could create a money supply that's big enough to fund all needed projects.
Yes, that is my contention.
And this will not be inflationary.
No, what's inflationary is borrowing the money, because then you have to continually inflate the money supply in order to pay back the interest. If you're only creating enough money to allow e-commerce to flourish and no more, then that money can recirculate without ever being inflationary. If you create money by borrowing it and you have to somehow come up with interest, then clearly if either you go bankrupt or you have to borrow more money, you roll over your loan, or other people borrow enough money to pay you back. It's a musical chairs kind of thing, and someone always loses. Under our current system, 95% of all small businesses go bankrupt within 5 years. People borrow money and put their hopes and dreams into a new restaurant or, a new craft shop or whatever they do.
Is there some sort of mechanism created that weighs various proposals that would be for public works? How's the money administered?
Well, that's what I was saying. Like with FDR, he just, and I can't really tell. They basically handed it out to community leaders, and the community leaders spent it on. But then they also had project directors too, where they built thousands and thousands of post offices. Well, that wasn't just every community leader deciding that. There was, and I'm not really clear, obviously, because I have studied a little bit, but I don't really understand the mechanisms. I know what they did, but I'm not really sure how they did it. But I'm pretty sure they did it through community-based. They did it as a community-based thing, because there's no way FDR could have overseen 4 million jobs in 6 months personally, while running the rest of the government. So.
You were last week pretty critical of the Defense Department and how we spend money fighting wars, and but why not do both? If we're going to issue money, then can't we continue to do that and just issue more money for what you want to do?
Well, actually, like I said, that's how Lincoln fought the Civil War without going into debt. He had just issued the greenbacks for the Civil War. personally, at the Green Party, one of our 4 key values is nonviolence. So I am more of a let's resolve our differences peacefully and not just go bomb everyone that happens to live on top of oil or coltran or whatever resources.
What is your stance on protection of our people? Because the reality is sometimes we have to bomb them before they bomb us.
Well, see, now I consider that paranoid schizophrenia. That's what I was trying to say. The idea that those people over there are going to get us, they're going to get us, and we are ruled by fear in
But
this
they
country.
did. I mean, they did get us, right? They flew planes into buildings in our country and killed thousands of people.
Well, that wasn't the Syrians, that wasn't
No,
the Iraqis,
but
that wasn't the
No,
Afghans,
you're
that
right.
wasn't the Pakistanis, that wasn't the Yemenis. I mean, to go on a 13-year killing spree because of a terrorist act, I just consider wrong.
But how do we protect do we protect ourselves, or do
Well,
we just
and that's the
say-
thing. We already had a giant national security apparatus before, and they didn't protect us, did they? And and the Air Force didn't scramble planes for 2 hours. Now, in a accountable society, I would think that the people in charge of those national security agencies, the FBI, the Pentagon, all of the Air Force, the NORAD, all of those people whose job it was to protect us and who failed miserably, not one of them was held accountable. What is up with that? We're holding 5-year-olds accountable in No Child Left Behind, but we don't hold the heads of the NSA, the FBI, the CIA, NORAD, Air Force, Pentagon. Not one of them was held accountable. Not only that, they got medals and promotions, and their budget was doubled because the so-called defense budget that we have now is double what it was in 2000. Now, why do you take people who have failed miserably and hand them twice as much money? That makes absolutely no sense to me. That's what I would say. Why are these people not at least fired, if not in jail, for failing like that? So and then after 9/11, they doubled the so-called defense budget. They went on a worldwide killing spree. They passed the Patriot Act, which spies on, and the NSA spies on all of us. Every one of our emails, this is what I said the other night, all of our phone calls, everything we do, they're spying on us. And yet they don't notice 20,000 jihadists ready to cross the border. So what good are they? We've given up our freedoms, we've given up $1 trillion, we've killed over 1 million people, and still they have the nerve to come back to us and say, oh, you're still not safe. Well, then what good are they?
Where are the million that we killed?
I'm talking about in Iraq mostly. There was a team that went to Iraq and did a door-to-door survey, and they came up with almost 1 million killed in Iraq. And then, of course, there's Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen and Libya. Don't forget Libya and Syria. Although that was our proxies in Syria so far.
Now, you mentioned that nonviolence is one of the 4 key values of the Green Party. What are the other 3 key values?
Well, one is social justice, which would be taken care of by the full employment, and environmental wisdom, which is also the Green New Deal, where we live within our planetary means. And then there's grassroots democracy, which is us trying to fight against the corporate-backed parties.
I listen to you on the radio sometimes on WDBX, and it's an interesting show. I think you bring up things that perhaps others don't consider. You've talked a number of times about production for use economy. Talk about that a little bit. What are you talking about?
Well, what that would be ideally, and that could be part of the Green New Deal, is you figure out what we need as a society, right? What is it that we need?
So the government figures this out?
Well, it could be the government, or it could just be we the people.
Okay.
Which, see, I think of the government as we the people.
Okay, all right.
You know, that's how I think of it.
And how is that expressed?
Well, it's, you know, it's, 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 Well, through our that's why I'm running for Congress, you know.
Fair
Through,
enough.
basically through our elected officials, and we should have more, you know, as Mike Bost pointed out, town hall meetings. Mr. I don't want to show up to the first debate, all of a sudden wants to have town hall meetings. So anyhow, we would decide what we need, and I would say, you know, food, water, housing is number 1, 2, and 3. We need health and education. Energy is nice. It's nice to have cell phones and internet. I mean, all the things that are kind of frills but are nice. If you look at FDR, I keep going back to the New Deal because I really admire what he did there. He had a second Bill of Rights, and in that second Bill of Rights, it's kind of what I think of as the needs of society. That everyone has a right to a house, everyone has a right to food, everyone has a right to employment, everyone has a right to health and education, and I forget what the other ones are, but yeah, the basics, we could figure out what we need, and then figure out how that everyone could have that. And then put the people that are available to work, creating that. For instance, right now we have a whole lot of homeless people and we have 20 million empty houses. But if people were to say, well, why don't we put homeless people in those houses, everyone would be like, that's absurd. You know, that's crazy. We don't build houses for homeless people to live in. We build houses for construction profits. And I would say, no, look at it more. You build houses for homeless people to live in. Like after World War II, there was a big housing shortage. My dad and mom lived with her parents when they first got married. And what the government did with the GI Bill was they had this big construction boom, and people who didn't have homes were able to buy homes. And that just seems like it should be a no-brainer, but if you look at the way we do things now, you don't produce for people for use. You produce for construction profits or commodity profits, which is what they call food now. You have hungry people, but you don't grow food for the hungry people, you grow food for commodity speculation. I mean, I just think it's bizarre. I think we ought to go back and look at the very, very basics of life, both on an individual and on a society level. If you look at the history of civilization, what has it been, 10,000 years, which came about because of agriculture, the whole basis of civilization is storing food for all of the people. That is what it was from the very beginning. They learned how to do agriculture, they learned how to store food, and the people that had control of the food then became the ruling class. But they always made sure that the people were fed. That was just basic. Either that or they got their heads cut off. And now it's like we're devolving away from that with the cutting the food stamps and stuff. It seems like we're devolving away from the very, very basics of civilization, which is to make sure that every member of the society has the basics of life. All I want to do is go back to basics.
So we the people, in other words the government, we decide what we need to produce. And then who does the producing?
The people there's like millions of people that need work. There's also something like 20 million unemployed people.
But are those people, do they work for the government then, or do they work
Yes,
for...
I think that it should be federally, I don't think we should give corporate welfare. That doesn't seem to work out in terms of creating jobs. I think the government should directly set up places that people go to work. Like they did in the New Deal, for instance, there was farmers that couldn't sell their produce and couldn't sell their livestock and stuff. So the government directly bought that from them and then directly employed people to can that food. And then they handed it out to people who are hungry. That just seems like a much more efficient way to do it than, handing Maytag $1 million worth of taxpayer-paid corporate welfare, and then 10 years later they pack up and leave. And all those people are left without jobs. I don't think that's right.
So existing companies that produce goods, would they still exist?
Yeah, they would exist, and they would be better off because people would have money to buy this stuff. This isn't supplanting the system we have now. This is putting more money into circulation so that people can buy what they want to buy. But there's some things that just aren't profitable, like health and educate. Well, they are the way we have it, but it doesn't work well for people. health and education and nursing homes, I don't think should be for profit. I think those could be directly government run, and then that would be money in the economy that could be spent on washing machines or whatever people need.
But let's say you got elected, you would be one voice among many, and you've described the vision that's rather sweeping. I mean, how would you be effective?
Well, that would be a problem, wouldn't it? I mean, I can't say that I would manage to persuade 435 other people, but if I persuaded enough, and there's people there that already have ideas like this. Like I said, Dennis Kucinich had, issued a bill, and other people have issued bills that I'm like all for. So it's not that people don't have visions. There's nothing I'm coming up with that other people haven't. It's just that the big money is so strong in controlling our elected governments that it's difficult for actual people and actual good ideas to make headway. So that's why I'm like, it's up to the people of Southern Illinois to elect me, and then it's up to people in other parts of the country to elect other people. I can't be held responsible for people in, Ohio. But I would like to make sure, I would like to think that there would be enough of us that we could really make a difference.
What would you suggest would be a proper response to keep us safe from terrorism?
Well, the proper response would be to, number one, to quit funding these jihadists. They call it blowback, which the United States spent, billions of dollars funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 80s, and then get all like, when it blows back. The same with these people in Syria. The United States has been funding these people, and so has Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. They've been funding these people. They still are funding these people. So how do you fund these people and then get all mad when they attack Americans? Quit it. Stop it. And I think we need a really, really strong defense. It's like we need to have a strong military. But it's like Scott Ritter says, you have to have a good fire department too, right? You want fire engines at work and firefighters that are in shape and trained, and you want all this stuff. You want fire hydrants at work, but that doesn't mean you support arson. You can support a strong defense without actually going and attacking other countries. These things are two different things.
Would you eliminate all foreign aid?
Most foreign aid is actually spent in the United States it's usually aid for American corporations like Bechtel and Halliburton and stuff. What it is they get corrupt leaders in other countries to borrow money from the United States, and then they spend it on our corporations building, especially, and banks and oil companies, to go over there, and almost always it benefits only the rich people in other countries and not the poor people. As a matter of fact, if Bechtel goes over to Bolivia and builds a dam and floods out 100,000 people, then who's that benefiting? It's not benefiting those 100,000 people that just got driven from their land. And that kind of thing goes on all over the world. It's happening in India right now, where they're fighting off. Hundreds of thousands of people are going to be flooded out, so that the people in Delhi can have their dam and their electricity. But all these poor people are going to be flooded out, and then what happens to them? They go to Bombay or Calcutta and live on the streets, starving to death, like so many others. So no, I'm not big on foreign aid.
So the answer is yes, you'd eliminate all of it?
Pretty much, yeah. Start from, what do you call that? Zero-based accounting.
Why raise the tax rate if creating money isn't an object?
Because right now the wealth in our country is so unevenly distributed that it's wrong. And until you create that money, right? Because monetary reform is a big deal. Most people don't understand anything about our money supply or how it's created or anything. So in order to get money for worthwhile social projects right now, you would have to bring back the progressive income tax that we had before Reagan, Bush, and Obama destroyed it. And you could put, like I said, a sales tax on Wall Street speculation, because Wall Street speculation is very, very harmful to our economy. Very harmful. Part of the reason we have these pension crises, you know, whenever these schemes collapse, they always go, well, you know, the really big losers were the institutional investors like pension funds. Well, who do you think those pension funds are? You know, these institutional investors that are losing these trillions of dollars, that's like Illinois public pension system. And then they turn around and tell us, oh, you have to make up for that. You know, they gambled on Wall Street and they lost $1 billion and you, the taxpayer, have to make up for it. I don't think so. Put a sales tax on that and you could raise a whole lot of money. Even if you only put, believe it or not, 1/4 cent. Now we, the people, pay 8% or more on everything we buy. They don't pay anything. Even if you put 1/4 cent on these sales that they do of stocks and bonds, you could raise $350 billion in a year. That's a lot of money, and that could be used for the good of the people. And it wouldn't really hurt them. They're so rich that it wouldn't, you know, London has a tax like that. And actually in Europe, they're really pushing for a speculation sales tax. So, and they're probably going to get it. And I don't see why we can't have it too. So a progressive income tax and a speculation sales tax, and then the reform of the
We do have a progressive federal tax. Are you saying more progressive?
Yes, because it's less progressive than it was. Remember, in the 50s...
The super wealthy pay more.
Right, right. First Reagan came and he cut the tax. Like it was like 90% in the 50s. Then Kennedy cut it down to, I believe, 80%. And then Reagan came in and cut it to...
It being what?
The top tax rate.
Oh.
And I think the top tax rate under that now is 36%. However, that's on earned income. On speculation, like the people on Wall Street, if the credit, what is it called, the capital gains tax is only 15%. So if you go out and gamble, you pay less taxes, fewer, yeah, is it less or fewer? Fewer taxes than you do if you earn it in an honest way, which all of us have jobs, all of us go out and earn our income. We provide labor, and that's where we get our income. We pay higher percent than people that gamble.
By conventional measurements, the odds are stacked against you in this race. I mean, that's a fact, and we've discussed that. And the question I want to ask is, in this what is a very close race, your candidacy could very well tip this race to Mike Bost, whose vision is probably less like yours than Bill Enyart's. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, if they're so worried about it, this is a Democrat-controlled state, they could change it immediately to instant runoff voting. That is where you go into the voting booth and you vote for your first choice and then you vote for your second choice. When the results are tallied, if no one gets 50% of the vote, they throw out the votes of the third one, right? And then they add the second choice to the results of the first thing, and then whoever gets more than 50% wins. This is a very easy, a very elegant solution. They've got it in San Francisco. They've got it in a couple other places that I can't remember right now. But if they were really, really worried about it, that's what they would do. It is not my place to refrain from running for office so that Bill Enyart can get in, because Bill Enyart and I don't agree. And the voters own the votes, not the parties. I think it's the height of arrogance for them to say, I would be stealing votes from a party. They don't own those votes. The voters own those votes. And the voters should vote for who they want to and not worry about, oh my gosh, I might hurt a political party. Who could fix it, as I said, like that? But they don't want to. They prefer to leave it so incredibly stacked against third parties and then terrorize their followers into voting. Because, oh my gosh, if you don't vote for Enyart, Bost will win and he's scary. He can't even put an entire sentence together.
Thank you.
We're good.
All
Thanks.
right, thank you.
Appreciate it.